Well, welcome back, folks. The Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. I'm your host, John Bona, and we're talking about the principles of a Christian economy. And we kind of left off with the discussion of capitalism. You know, Milton Friedman, the great economist, he said that individual liberty and economic liberty are inseparable. Both are products of the Christian ethic. That's what he said. He was referring to capitalism, which that word has been misunderstood by so many people. And capitalism, which really is another word for free market, free enterprise, it's given a greater number of people more prosperity, more economic liberty than any other economic system that ever existed in the world. Now, is it a coincidence that the greatest amount of economic liberty and prosperity happens to exist in countries where Christianity has had great influence? Is that just a coincidence? I don't think so. You know, Christianity produces a moral code that we're supposed to live by. Now, Rabbi Lapin, one of my favorite rabbis, I love the guy. He has a program. I don't know if you guys have watched it. But in his last program I watched, he made a comment. He said, he was talking about America's economy as well. And he said, it's no accident that a capital market has ever arisen in any non-Christian country. Isn't that interesting, Marshall?
Well, exactly, and that's the history that I was talking about in the beginning. That we need to not fly in the face of history. Don't think we've come up with some new way through Keynesian economics or Marxism to overcome the problem of poverty by giving away other people's wealth. It doesn't work, and it's been proven again and again in history that if we, beginning with Patrick in Ireland, beginning in the Middle Ages when they had feudalism and they broke everything up into local units and everybody had their self-governing little farm and they took care of themselves. Great productivity resulted from that. And then they started limiting the power of kings. And this is where you get to America, because when the Pilgrims came over, what happened is they realized that you can't have economic prosperity unless you have political prosperity and religious liberty. If you don't have the three liberties together, then what happens is that the king or the ruler comes in and eats whatever economic prosperity you develop. And if you don't have religious liberty, then you don't have Christianity. Without Christianity, there's no Christian character. And so either of those two liberties being lost, you can have all the free enterprise you want. You can talk about free enterprise economics, Austrian economics, and I was an economics major in college. I mean, I heard all the economic theories, and they're all bogus. They do not work. The one that has worked is the one that no one wants to talk about, and that is the biblical principles of economics laid out very simply in the Holy Scriptures. When those are obeyed, there's economic progress on a quintessential scale that just takes off and helps everybody to succeed.
Wow.
I think it's funny to consider the fact that we use this term called GDP, gross domestic production or gross domestic product. And the two mechanisms by which you increase gross domestic production or products is to increase the work-age population. Gee, sounds familiar, doesn't it? What did he tell Adam and Eve? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And the second thing is to increase your productivity. If a man does not work, he does not eat. These are two principles that both happen in the home. Without these two principles, an economy, its gross domestic production, will fall. And yet, that's in fact where our country is going. We have many countries around the world have no real population growth. Europe, China's at a one-child rule, and China's heading for basically zero GDP growth from that leg of the stool, which is their population of work-age people. In the next about 70 years, they're going to see flatline growth in that area. And yet somehow they thought that was wisdom that would push their nation into leadership. In fact, it's going to pull them down. And it's funny to me that if you don't have that moral code, Marshall, like you were talking about, you won't see Christian families. You won't see monogamous husband-wife relationships having many children with roles defined for husbands and wives so that there's stability in that home. And then you won't see that teaching of that work ethic that's not about just yourself, but a bigger moral code. In other words, I'm not what's in it for me. I mean, in our own home, our kids start learning chores around 4 and 5 years old. And I've told the story at some events where we used to see the 4-year-old, my second oldest daughter, walking around the yard after collecting the eggs. She'd be about 4 or 5, swinging that bucket around her head because she's noticing a butterfly. And, of course, we had scrambled eggs that day. But the whole point is they were engaged in the production of the whole home on an everyday basis, not for just their own personal satisfaction, but the teamwork of that family. Well, when people start to think that way, then what they do is not about just themselves. That's where capitalism is so successful. When you bring that moral code into capitalism, that I produce in excess, that it can glorify God, then we go back to biblical principles about the money in the poor box for the poor. What about the widows and orphans? What about adopting those children? What about your neighbor that's struggling? What about building businesses that aren't just about me selling out and being ready to go golf and sit in my boat, but to actually build businesses for generations and people into the future, for future jobs? And that kind of mindset is what makes capitalism, and the Pilgrims introduced that type of capitalism, made it so successful. There can be a kind of capitalism that is all about greed, but you know what? Francis Schaeffer has this word he puts in his book called Christian Manifesto. It's called the inevitable event. We either do things God's way, and if we do it that way, there's an inevitable blessing that's coming, or we do things man's way, and there's an inevitable cursing that's coming. And this nation is in the pendulum of choosing right now. And I do think we're waking up. I don't know, Marshall, you can comment on this, you too, John, but people seem to be waking up that we can't keep going down the same path, that some things need to change.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. And Dan, I think it's a great point. And it really begs the question, I think, that, why was America so successful? I think our listeners would like to know that. Why did America enjoy this economic liberty that we now see we're losing? And there's no doubt that it was the Christian religion was essential for our prosperity because it teaches what you just were talking about, the need for good, hard work. And, the worker deserves his wages, right, in the book of Luke. So, Scripture also shows us that, what is inside of us will ultimately come out in our words, our attitudes, and yes, our work habits, how hard we'll work. It's interesting, at the end of the 19th century, America's prosperity produced about half of everything, really, on the whole planet, with only about 6% of the entire world's population. That's an interesting statistic. And one of the primary reasons for our great success story is that it can be traced back to our founding documents, of course, that were taken from Scripture, the Constitution, and that our founders put in place and thought out deeply so that this economic liberty we're talking about could be lived out in a free market society, in a system. And the great thing I love to see is how this free market system, entrepreneurs, business people, workers, they seek opportunities, they venture into new industries, they're creative, they make a variety of new products and services, and at the same time, they're creating millions of jobs. And it works good. And look at all the people that have come to America from other nations. It's a proven fact. We're not going over there. They're coming here. They're to start a business, to find a job, start a family, and enjoy and prosper in a land of economic liberty. And I'll tell you, something needs to be said about people that are successful, because I know some, you guys do. A lot of these people, these entrepreneurs, they're charitable. They've built hospitals. Marshall, you could tell that story. Art museums, parks, schools that have benefited society in general. And several of these entrepreneurs have deep Christian convictions and compassion to help the needy, to assist them and help them climb out of poverty, teach them how to fish, in other words. And that's one of the great things I think that we don't talk about a lot, is how the Christian faith has produced these ideas that men have used to create business, and they've done good things with their money.
Well, exactly, and that's the story of private charity, which is the story of America. Who stayed behind 5 years later and was still working on the tsunami? It was Christian charities, private charities funded by entrepreneurs. The truth of all that is so obvious that, but nobody brings it up. If you wanted to solve the welfare problems in America, and we have the problem of poverty, the obvious way to do it is to get the government out of the way. And we can't do that overnight. We understand we have to have Social Security for now, and we have to have Medicare for now for those that are already on it. But the truth is that those programs should be decentralized and put in the hands of private enterprise, and then private enterprise should be inspired to give to charity. Specifically, all of the charities from the Salvation Army to thousands of other charities that are good out there do a much better job of taking care of the poor, the needy, and job creation than any government program, because they're accountable to their donors, and their donors aren't going to give money to a group that doesn't accomplish what it says it's going to do. Now, how would it be if we said to the government, if we don't think that you're doing a good job, we're not going to turn our taxes in? Well, they just come take you away, right? And so that's what's called tyranny. That's not liberty. Liberty is to allow the individuals who have a Christian conscience and character to give to entrepreneurial and yet nonprofit agencies that are given to the poor and the needy, and to evangelistic organizations that reach those that need to know the gospel. All of these entities, and there are hundreds of thousands of good nonprofits like the World History Institute, which I've been the president of for 30 years. And we're very small, but we're growing, and people are understanding that what we do is help to transform the way people understand history so that they can transform their nation, and they're supporting us. Well, we need to have more and more charity and less government. Then we would have a society of liberty rather than a society of tyranny.
And we can take that to the local level. You can take it right to a family. Look how much more 10 families can do to help each other when they know specific needs. They know this mom just gave birth to a baby and her husband's struggling with his job. They know specific needs to minister to that no government program or agency could ever know, and yet they can keep that respect for that family in terms of let them continue to earn their way and maintain that. I'm trying to look for the right word. It's that respect for who they are, so they don't feel like they're just getting a handout. They're part of a organism that cares about one another, knows the needs of each other, and that's a healthier environment than just a check that comes beaming in, and you get it, and you go, well, I got this. I guess this takes care of my problem for today. One is continuing to encourage people to learn to fish versus just give them a fish. And I'm going to go back to a little example here. We talk about honesty, and we talk about that truth. Christ came into the world to testify to the truth. Today we have a thing called a fractional reserve system, which means for every dollar that's printed and put into a bank, the bank then redistributes or borrows money against it. It used to be up to 10 times. Now we take a dollar and we fractionally borrow money against it 35 times.
Wow.
What I'm trying to get at here is there's a dishonesty there. What happens when someone says, well, how many claims do I have against my dollar? Well, today you have 35 claims against that dollar. In the days of gold and silver, when that was the coinage that you used, which is what God has asked us to use, there's an honesty there. It's a real $20 gold piece. It's a real Liberty dollar that has real value and can buy real things. There's not a fractional reserve or multiple claims against that dollar. Our money is teaching young people a lie. It's teaching them to be dishonest by the nature of how it works. And when we talk about government distributing to the poor, government distributing to get things done. We're fractionally borrowing money, which means there's many claims on the same dollar, that if anybody ever asked, well, can I get my dollar back? Well, you really can't, because there are 35 claims against it. And this dishonesty in economics pours into people's mindset even when they're at work. So we need to change it. There has to be this honesty put back in. That same honesty exists, and I think I said this some months ago on one of our talks, one of these shows, that if someone came to your door and said, Dan, it's the day to collect the $612 for the snow removal for your county roads, if you had to write that check out for $612, you'd really want to know, okay, what are we doing with our $612? You'd have a tendency to attend the meetings. You'd have a tendency to make sure honest men were in leadership making decisions. So whenever you move these things to the local level, where it's not hidden or it doesn't go into the black hole, or it's not trillions, but it's real dollars that you can understand, there's an honesty that begins to settle in, just like helping a family out. If you go over to a family's house and they're not living by biblical principles and they're creating all this hardship, there'll be some grace and mercy at first to help them. But pretty soon they've got to change their ways. They've got to learn to fish, and they got to get up on their feet and start doing things right. And then you can come alongside them and disciple them so that their lives can improve. But if they choose perdition, they choose to go the wrong way, there is a time when you've got to let things get worse so they can get better. The way it works today, there's a complete dishonesty. No matter how bad you make it, you still get the same thing, same amount of benefit, even if the next guy is trying hard to correct his situation.
You know, Dan, I remember you mentioned that book to me on this program a few times, the book called The Wealth of Nations that Adam Smith wrote.
That's right.
And, you know, in that book, it's a great book that he describes the 4 basic economic liberties needed for a nation to have a free market system. And basically the 4 liberties are, you know, the liberty, or he uses the word freedom, I think, to try to do something, the liberty to buy, the liberty to sell, and yes, the liberty to fail. Not everybody succeeds. Now, I'll tell you, the greatest enemy, and you just addressed it, we all have, of this free enterprise system is a large government that places overbearing taxes and regulations and controls on individuals and their business. You know, these tentacles of government, big government, are always far-reaching. And it always results in less productivity of goods and services. And that's why we have higher unemployment right now. People are wondering, I think in our county here, we're up to 13% unemployment. See, it virtually takes away individuals' liberty and to be economically productive. And I'll tell you, anybody listening who owns a business or works for one, or if you've developed property, you know what I'm talking about. The overbearing amount of regulation, paperwork, and red tape hurled at private enterprise. I was talking to a large developer up in New York, and he said, this is a multi-billion-dollar company, but he said they spent 75% of their corporate manpower on providing what he considered unnecessary paperwork to all these different government agencies. Now, could you imagine that? If they could spend that time on being productive and creating jobs and new developments? Now, look, now I'm not saying, I know some local regulation is needed, like, you know, reasonable building codes, sanitary, environmental, you know, health matters. But the U.S. Constitution stated that the federal government was only to be involved in matters like, you know, interstate transportation, things like that, or defense. It wasn't to interfere with private enterprise, right, Marshall?
Well, exactly, and that's the injustice of it all. Let's call it what it is. We, beginning at the church, and let's put the onus where it belongs. We, over the past 100 years, have given up an understanding of biblical law, understanding of the Old Testament, which gave us all of these principles of not stealing a man's property. When you develop regulations that make it impossible for a guy to start a business or expand his business or use his property, then you are stealing his property. And that's what the government is doing. But we are a government of the people and by the people and for the people. It is we that have allowed this government to get out of control. And why has it happened? I would put the onus of that entire thing upon the church. And I'm not speaking about one specific church. I'm talking about we, the Christian people of America, which is the largest single minority in the country that meets every Sunday morning. And yet, if you were to talk to the vast majority of pastors, do they address this issue of just weights and measures, this issue of big government and how it's destroying the freedom and liberty of the people and how that's against God's law? I would find not one in 1,000 addresses that issue. In fact, if you look at the one famous passage in Micah, that you hear this preached a lot. This is the famous passage that says, this is what God desires of us. And it says, He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what God the Lord requires of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. How many messages have we heard about doing mercy and walking humbly with our God? But how many times have we heard someone, a pastor or a Christian leader, stand up, not only in the pulpit, but then in the civil sphere and say, this is unjust. This piece of paper you call a dollar bill is not a dollar bill. It has nothing behind it. It must be just weights and measures. You're stealing from the widows and the orphans. You're stealing from the poor people, and you, the government, and those in control of the system are sucking it dry through the banking system and through the government before the people ever see the dollar, and the dollar is shrinking 10% a year, 20% a year, and I think very soon the dollar will be minuscule what it is today. We need to be preaching, speaking to the government, speaking to the people so that people can change the government, that we can have men of honesty and integrity who will not just say, let's have a little bit of socialism. They'll say, no, let's go back to what we had in America for 350 years until the Great Depression in the 1930s when Roosevelt brought in the whole conception of Keynesian economics.
We have about a minute here to wind up and our program this evening. And, we've learned real clear tonight that we learned from the conduct of the oppressors of the world over time that the light, the Holy Scriptures are really hostile to them. So they labor to keep men in darkness. And in some places, they actually prohibit the reading of Holy Scripture. In other places, they seem to support Christianity in public, but behind the scenes, they're working to tear it down. But folks, if you remove the darkness and you let the light shine through, this America will be emancipated again. And that is the great hope that we have. Folks, I'll leave you with one thought. Behind every order, there's always a God, be it God himself or those who have control over the state. The state becomes a God in itself if there is no appeal to a higher authority. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us, thestoryofliberty.net. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. God bless you. Have a good evening.